Theirs was a storybook romance between a charismatic teacher.
He wanted to have the best, and he did give her the best.
And a kind-hearted daycare worker.
I think what attracted Avis to Keon was his charm.
But it all ended tragically for the young lovers when one fell victim to a nightmarish crime.
She was savagely attacked.
It makes you feel sick.
The search for the killer would unveil a sordid web of lust and betrayal.
I said a prayer, Lord, let me find who did this.
And along the way, prompt a terrifying question. Was this really a tale of two soulmates torn apart by a vicious crime? Or was one half of this seemingly perfect couple a monster at heart?
You wonder who in the world would do something like this.
November 29th, 2006, Ridgeland, Mississippi. It's just past 8:30 p.m. in this tranquil suburb of Jackson. In her house on Old Square Court, 37-year-old Sabrina Coleman is settling in for the night when she's startled by an unusual noise.
She just hears this horrendous pounding on her front door. She thought somebody was actually trying to break in the front door of her house. She realizes that it's her neighbor, Keon, is standing at the door.
Avis been shot, call 911.
Sabrina phones emergency responders. Within minutes, Ridgeland police arrive on the scene. In the garage of Keon's house, they make a horrifying discovery.
The carport door is open. They see Keon Pittman there in the garage next to the body of Avis Banks.
27-year-old Avis Banks is Keon Pittman's fiancée. She's lying in a pool of blood. After ushering Keon away from her body, police check Avis's vital signs, but it's clear there's no saving her.
She was savagely attacked.
Gunshot to the thigh, gunshot to her buttocks area. She had a gunshot into her chest cavity, and then there was a lethal gunshot wound behind her left ear.
But the gunshot wounds aren't the only injuries Avis has suffered.
Her neck had been slashed, she had been stabbed.
She had a total of 4 stab wounds.
It's a gruesome scene, made even more tragic by what a devastated Keon Pittman tells Detective Frank Dillard.
We were informed that she was at least 5 months pregnant.
You wonder who in the world would do something like this.
Especially to someone as beloved as Avis. The middle of 3 daughters, Avis was raised in a devout Christian household in Vicksburg, Mississippi.
She did girly things, but mainly she would go to school, come home, do her homework, read the Bible, and go to bed.
She was a sweet, loving, kind person.
Avis's parents were of modest means, but they had high hopes for her.
She grew up with 2 great parents, a blue-collar family. Her family was especially proud of her. She was the first member of her family to go into complete college.
She had gotten her degree, the early childhood education. Her goal was to open up her own daycare center.
Avis was passionate about being a preschool teacher, but she also had big dreams of having a family of her own.
She wanted a family. She wanted a house full of kids.
She wasn't the go out and party type girl. It was family first with Avis.
Which explains why Avis was instantly drawn to Keon Pittman. The two initially met at a fitness club.
He approached her and, asked her name. He did mention the fact that she was attractive. She kind of blushed and giggled. Well, they talked for a little while and they exchanged numbers. I think what attracted Avis to Keon was his charm.
Keon also shared Avis's passion for educating children. He taught middle school science and coached basketball.
Once we found out Avis was a teacher, I was like, okay, could be a little match.
After just a few weeks of dating, Avis felt the time was right to introduce Keon to her parents. He definitely made a good first impression.
Avis's parents liked Keon because he seemed to take good care of their daughter, and their daughter cared about him. Mm-hmm. He looks like somebody who would be a great dad and a great husband.
Keon and Avis were madly in love. But just a year into their relationship, Keon accepted a teaching position at a middle school in Jackson, 45 miles away. He asked Avis to come with him. Avis had some reservations about living with a man out of wedlock, but Keon promised to make it official.
They were planning on being married in January 2007.
Once in Jackson, Keon quickly settled into his new position. The couple decided to buy a 2-bedroom house in a suburb of Ridgeland.
Ridgeland's family-oriented and just a small community where you feel like you can trust people.
So everybody knows everybody, it seems like.
A few months later, the couple had some more big news to share.
When Avis did call to tell me that she was pregnant, I was very excited. Avis was very happy. She was ready to go out and start buying clothes and toys. We were looking forward to our children growing up together and having the bond and the relationship that she and I had.
As Avis began prepping the house for the arrival of their first child, Keon took a second job, bartending nights at a restaurant called On the Border.
Keon wanted to provide for Avis. He wanted to have the best, and he did give her the best.
With a love that seemed to know no bounds, it seemed to Avis and Keon were living a dream life together, which made the nightmarish scene inside their garage the night of November 29th, 2006, that much harder to fathom. As Detective Dillard and the other homicide investigators survey Avis's mutilated body, a sense of outrage overtakes them.
I said a prayer, Lord, let me find who did this.
But what investigators don't know is that before they can bring Avis's killer to justice, they'll have to untangle an intricate web of sex, lies, and betrayal, and a shocking motive that points the finger at the unlikeliest of suspects. A new house, pending nuptials, a baby on the way. Avis Banks and Keon Pittman are looking forward to spending the rest of their lives together.
Avis was very happy with Keon. Avis was happy with the way the relationship was progressing.
Avis loved that boy.
But this fairy tale romance came crashing down the night of November 29th, 2006. Avis lies dead on the cold floor of her garage. Her body is riddled with bullets. She's also been stabbed repeatedly, and her throat has been slashed. And as for Keon, he's beside himself with grief. As they survey the scene, investigators are struck by the location of Avis's body.
Avis's body was laying on the ground next to the front tire, laying on her back. It looked like she had just gotten out of her car, was approaching the door of the residence when the suspect opened up the door and surprised her.
Could Avis's death be the byproduct of a botched robbery? Judging from the scene investigators encountered inside the house, that appears to be the case.
The residence appears to have been ransacked.
Electronics have been turned over and dressers have been emptied out.
It looked like maybe this was, in fact, a burglary that may have been interrupted by Avis coming home.
Near the back of the house, investigators spot the burglar's likely point of entry.
The back door had been kicked in at the house. There was a shoe print left on that back door.
The shoe print seems like further evidence that a robbery has taken place. But in another part of the house, homicide detective Lieutenant John Neal makes a curious discovery.
There was a master bathroom, and there were some under cabinet doors that were left open where you would keep your bathroom cleaning stuff. And I worked burglaries for 24 years, and I don't ever know of any burglar who has gone into a bathroom looking for valuable items.
And as he and the other detectives make their way through the rest of the house, Lieutenant Neal realizes that even though the place has been ransacked, nothing of value seems to be missing, which begs another question.
If this was just a residential burglary, why even attack Avis? You had every opportunity to go and leave prior to her coming into the house.
This discovery, coupled with the brutal nature of Avis's injuries, has Lieutenant Neal rethinking the robbery angle.
We felt like, based off the injuries inflicted on her body, that this was somebody who was close to Avis. We felt like this was personal.
But who in the world would hold such a deadly grudge against a kind-hearted mother-to-be like Avis? Detectives turn to her fiancé, Keon Pittman, to help answer that question.
When you have a crime such as this, you always start with that inner circle, people closest to your victim, to figure out what your victim is like and what they do, and then you work out from your circle, trying to identify suspects.
Though he seems heartbroken by Avis's death, Keon pulls himself together and retraces the events leading to the discovery of Avis's body. According to this mild-mannered teacher and coach, this basketball team had practice at 5, roughly the same time that Avis was scheduled to get off work.
He called Avis and he said he would pick up some things from the grocery store and cook because she didn't feel like it. She was 5 months pregnant.
Keon tells the investigators that basketball practice wrapped up around 7:30. After that, he picked up the groceries and headed home.
Once he let the garage door up, he sees Avis's body laying there beside her car.
According to Keon, he rushed to Avis's side.
Avis! Wait a minute!
With Avis unresponsive, Keon ran next door and urged Sabrina Coleman to get help.
Avis has been shot! Call 911, please!
Keon's story seems genuine, but investigators still need him to come down to the station and give a formal statement.
He was brought to the police station to be interviewed, was mainly just to get a good written statement from him, to lay out some basis for his timeline, where he was, where Avis was, what was going on in her life at that time.
But in speaking with Keon, investigators are struck by a couple of odd details.
Someone did mention, why didn't you just use your own cell phone? He said he never thought about that, but he just ran to the neighbor's house.
As they ask these questions, the detectives notice that Keon's demeanor begins to change. He now seems more agitated than grief-stricken.
Tell me what's going on.
He's not showing the behavior of a person who had just lost a loved one.
I don't like this little brother. I don't like being up here. I'd rather be back downstairs.
He was constantly on his cell phone. They want me to use the bathroom, or I can't do this, I can't do that. Finally, I reminded him, hey, you have a dead fiancé and your unborn child is in her stomach and they're dead.
I don't know nothing, man. More than you going out. I don't know. You the one in here asking me these questions, man. I don't know nothing.
Keon's peculiar behavior prompts detectives to slide a Miranda warning in front of him. Keon refuses to sign it and accuses the police of trying to pin the murder on him.
I'm not gonna sign that because you could easily go back and write in charges. But y'all trying to charge me with something. That's the way it's looking. I really don't like the situation at all. I'd rather have a lawyer here or someone.
He wanted to talk to a lawyer immediately.
Could nice guy Keon Pittman have something to do with his fiancée's murder? It hadn't appeared that way at first, but now investigators are having second thoughts.
When Keon reached out to his attorney, it kind of struck us as odd. It kind of made us change our focus a little bit to maybe dig into him a little bit more to see what he was about.
But just as they begin to wonder if Keon Pittman might be involved in his fiancée's death,
I don't know nothing, man.
a new suspect emerges. One who casts the investigation in an entirely different light. "24 hours have passed since mother-to-be Avis Banks was brutally gunned down in the garage of the home in Ridgeland, Mississippi, that she shares with the love of her life and husband-to-be Keon Pittman.
My first emotion was, who would do this? Why would you kill a pregnant lady?
I said, who would shoot Avis? Everybody love Avis. Avis don't bother nobody.
Police initially suspect a robbery gone awry. But after exhibiting strange behavior during his formal statement, Avis's fiancé, unassuming school teacher Keon Pittman, has become the focus of the investigation. Detectives obtain a copy of Keon's cell phone records, wondering if they might place him at home at the time of the crime, rather than wrapping up basketball practice at Chastain Middle School.
We're able to get locations that his cell phone was during various times he was making telephone calls.
Keon's phone records confirm his original story, that he was at the school at the time of the crime. A number of eyewitness accounts further solidify this alibi.
There were some folks saying that he was there at the school, at the gym, between 5:45 and 6 o'clock when Avis was killed. It was a pretty solid alibi from the police point of view.
However, Keon's cell phone records reveal a side of him no one knew existed.
Through his cell phone records, we were able to see that there was several women that he was involved in.
It's clear from the text messages that these relationships weren't just innocent flirtations. Some of them seem like full-blown affairs.
Keon is a womanizer. That's what it boils down to.
Keon's cell phone records also make it clear Avis knew about her fiancé's extracurricular activities.
There was a text message that was discovered on his phone that was from Avis, to where she was questioning his commitment to the relationship. We felt like maybe she had discovered that there were other women involved in his life.
But none of her immediate family can fathom the notion that Keon was unfaithful.
There was love there between Avis and Keon. He loved Avis and Avis loved him.
They were in love. They wanted to raise a family together.
He was a college graduate, a hard worker. He looks like somebody who would be a great dad and a great husband and supportive of his family.
Keon's fellow teachers say the same thing.
Keon Pittman is described as a well-liked teacher down there. He gets along well with everybody.
Lieutenant Neal and Detective Dillard decide to speak with Keon's co-workers at his other place of business, on the Border Bar and Grill. Perhaps they've noticed Keon paying special attention to some of his female customers. Keon's fellow bartenders can recall only one.
There's one that sees him a lot.
A woman who comes in nearly every night Keon works. Her name is Carla Hughes. So how did Keon come to know Carla Hughes? The answer comes as a surprise to investigators.
They think that they work together at Chastain Middle School.
The name Carla Hughes didn't come up in detectives' initial conversation with Keon's fellow teachers.
Anything I could do, you let me know on that one.
But a little digging reveals there's a 6th grade teacher at the school by that name. And like Keon, she's new to the staff.
Okay, guys, remember to do your homework on Thursday.
She moved to Jackson around July of 2006 to become a teacher at Chastain Middle School. Carla was regarded as a very professional teacher. Super smart, just helpful, caring, dedicated.
Carla certainly doesn't sound like the type to be involved with a man who's engaged to another woman. But just in case, detectives decide to pay a visit to the school's principal.
Tell us a little bit about Keon. How long have you been here?
The plan is to see if the principal has heard rumors of an alleged affair between Keon and Carla. But before they can ask that question, investigators are interrupted by a surprise visitor.
While I'm talking to the principal, lo and behold, Carla comes in, hysterical. She's crying.
Where's Keon? Is he okay? What happened to him?
Unprompted, Carla announces she's beside herself about the death of Keon's wife and unborn child. But her reaction seems a bit too dramatic.
I found that to be highly unusual.
Detectives ask Carla to accompany them to the station for a formal interview.
If you'll let me finish up here, I'd love to talk.
Carla agrees. Sitting across from Carla in the interrogation room, detectives can see why a man, even one who's spoken for, would be attracted to her.
She was very outgoing, very attractive girl, kind of athletic, but very attractive. She would be one of the ladies you would notice.
Carla Hughes is a beautiful woman. She appears to have it all.
Raised in Greenville, Mississippi, Carla is the epitome of an all-American girl.
She was involved in band, cheering, tennis, soccer, student body organization. She was Miss Washington County Junior Miss and Miss Greenville Teen.
After high school, she went to University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg. She graduated with honors.
But if Carla Hughes is the all-American, put-together woman everybody claims she is, why would she even consider having an affair with a man whose fiancée is pregnant? And if the suspicions are true, and Carla and Keon are sleeping together, what does their relationship have to do with the murder of Avis Banks?
She may know things that can get us to talk to him more. Then we can probably extract information from her.
They were pushing her about her relationship with Keon.
How close would you say that you are?
We're just friends. We work together.
She was saying that her and Keon was just friends, no romantic relationship.
When pressed by detectives, Carla admits that she often visits Keon at work. These revelations, coupled with statements given by Keon's co-workers at On the Border, convince detectives that Carla and Keon are more than just friends. And they press Carla to admit it.
You won't lie to me about this.
I'm not.
Okay. Were you two involved with each other?
Yes.
According to Carla, the relationship started innocently enough, just two young teachers trying to fit in at a new school.
He was kind of taking her in, showing her the ropes of that new job.
Though Carla claims it didn't take long for that friendship to turn into something else.
They started sending notes via students. Keon just paid her so much attention. That really is what kind of hooked her in. Keon and Carla's relationship heats up really quickly. I believe like the second time he came over, they wound up having sex.
Pretty soon, Carla and Keon are hooking up at every possible opportunity.
They're meeting up after school. She's going to the restaurant where he bartends.
Detectives inform Avis's family of Keon's infidelity. Needless to say, they're floored.
Everything that I thought about him changed. And the only thing I could think of was, why would you waste a perfect relationship to go out and do this?
Keon Pittman is a snake in the grass.
But how does Keon's alleged infidelity factor into the murder of his fiancée? With no further questions, detectives tell Carla Hughes she's free to go. But within hours of doing so, a surprise phone call comes in.
Hello?
And sends the investigation in a new direction. A direction that will ultimately lay bare the hidden desires and unchecked obsessions that led to the murder of Avis Banks. It's now been 48 hours since Keon Pittman discovered the body of his pregnant fiancée, Avis Banks, in the garage of their home in the Jackson, Mississippi suburb of Ridgeland. After initially focusing on a possible robbery motive, police have shifted their attention to Keon, or more precisely, to his fellow teacher, Carla Hughes, who, despite her intelligence and striking good looks, has admitted to having an affair with Keon.
Were you two involved with each other?
Yes.
After releasing Carla, detectives question her friends and family and discover a possible motive Carla might have for wanting Avis Banks dead. Like Avis, Carla was engaged to be married until her fiancé called it off at the last minute.
The man that she was supposed to marry when she got pregnant didn't stand by her side, and I think that left really a bitter taste in her mouth.
Is it possible that Avis Banks was murdered by Carla Hughes so that Carla could live the fairy tale life with Keon instead of Avis?
She saw the things that Keon did for Avis. She made her want the things Avis had in her life.
The fact that Keon was standing beside his pregnant fiancée and supporting her, I think Carla was jealous of that.
But you told me you love me, though.
Don't try to make me the bad guy. I don't want to hear none of this stuff about love and all this stuff. You knew what this was.
To detectives, it looks increasingly like Carla Hughes had ample motive to murder Avis Banks. That's when they receive another unexpected call.
Hello?
This one from a local attorney.
The attorney had a client in his office who felt like they were in possession of the firearm that was used in the murder of Avis Banks.
That afternoon, the lawyer and his client are sitting at the Richland Police Department, and they've brought with them an empty .38 caliber revolver.
We knew at that point that the projectiles removed from the body, from Avis's body, were definitely .38s.
But the caliber of the weapon isn't all that piques detectives' interest.
The gentleman who had the gun indicated that he was a family member of Carla Hughes.
The man's name is Patrick Nash. Patrick is Carla's cousin, and he tells detectives that 3 days before Avis's murder, Carla showed up at his house with an unusual request.
Well, my cousin Carla, she came over and borrowed a gun and a knife for protection.
Carla had told Patrick that there had been a recent string of break-ins in her neighborhood that she feared for her safety.
He loaned her a gun and a knife.
Patrick tells detectives that a couple of days after the murder, Carla returned the gun, minus 5 rounds of ammo.
She said she had been used those bullets on target practicing. The knife was never returned.
According to Patrick, Carla was asked, hey, if we take this gun to the police, are they going to link it back to that murder in Ridgeland? And Carla didn't answer. She just kind of hung her head.
Carla's cousin has provided investigators with the break they've been looking for. They thank Patrick Nash for his help, collect his gun, and send it to their ballistics lab for testing. 48 hours later, they have their results.
That was, in fact, the weapon that was used to shoot and kill Avis Banks.
That afternoon, Ridgeland police issue a warrant for the arrest of Carla Hughes.
Carla, through her attorney, learned that we had an arrest warrant for her. She arrived at the police department. She was taken into custody.
With Carla in custody, police pepper her with questions. They start by asking her where she was the night Avis Banks was murdered.
Her alibi is that she's home for several hours, then goes to a local track in which she jogs, then returns home.
Police aren't buying it. But in order to press charges against Carla, they need evidence that definitively places her at the crime scene. Searching in Carla's bedroom, Lieutenant Neal and his men come across a nightstand filled with personal keepsakes.
This was where Carla kept all of her stuff that would be private to her.
Among the items in the drawer is a photo of Keon along with a poem entitled, I Discovered.
The language in the poem was such that I've longed for you all my life. I've been waiting for somebody like you, our life together, stuff that would have made the recipient of it think I'm in a relationship with this person.
At the bottom of the poem are the initials KP.
We assumed was Keon Pittman.
While the poem and the picture are further proof of Keon and Carla's affair, they don't tie Carla to the murder in a concrete fashion. But when they search Carla's bedroom closet, Lieutenant Neal's team finds a far more compelling piece of evidence.
We were able to locate a shoebox that contained a pair of black rubber sole tread-safe shoes.
The tread pattern appears to be a match for the shoe print the killer left on Avis and Keon's back door. The shoes are sent to the crime lab for analysis. As he waits for results, Lieutenant Neal pulls Carla's cell phone records.
We were able to go back, get poll records with who she was calling, and not only that, but where she was when she was placing these phone calls.
Lieutenant Neal determines that Carla and her phone were in the vicinity of Keon and Avis's house just moments before the crime occurred.
At the time that Avis would have been arriving at home, Carla's records put her in that vicinity at the Banks residence.
But the cell phone records aren't the only thing that places Carla near the crime scene. CSIs determined that the tread on the shoes found in Carla's closet is the exact match for the shoe print found on Avis and Keon's back door.
We have the cell phone records, of course. We have the gun. We have the shoes. We have motive.
On Friday, December 8th, 2006, District Attorney Michael Guest formally charges Carla Hughes with murder.
She was charged with 2 counts of capital murder for the death of Avis Banks and the death of the unborn child of Avis Banks.
Her being one of Keon's mistresses was a very big shock.
The following morning, news of the indictment is splashed across the front page of the local paper. Seeing a beloved middle school teacher charged with capital murder sends shockwaves through the Richland community.
She was like the all-American church-going young lady, sorority girl.
I didn't understand how Carla could do that to her.
We were just shocked. You couldn't think. You couldn't do anything except just pray.
I think it's hard for them to accept that she would have any part in a murder.
But as prosecutors prepare their case against Carla, detectives turn their attention back to Keon Pittman and a question that's been gnawing at them since his initial interview. Is Keon Pittman truly innocent of his fiance's murder? Or is he the crime's mastermind? Ridgeland, Mississippi is known for its quiet streets and cozy small-town feel. It's where Avis Banks planned to spend the rest of her life with her handsome husband-to-be, Keon Pittman. But in 2006, the murder of this beautiful, expectant mother has rocked this suburb of Ridgeland to its core.
I was really shocked just to hear this murder in Ridgeland because it just was so unexpected in this area.
It makes you feel sick when you hear that a woman who was 5 months pregnant is murdered.
Even more unexpected is the identity of the woman accused of the crime. Beautiful young school teacher Carla Hughes, who detectives have discovered was carrying on an affair with Avis Banks' fiancé, fellow school teacher Keon Pittman.
I'm thinking, what in the world has gone on here? You have a young woman whose life is on track, and all of a sudden, you bottom out.
I think Carla snapped. I think she was jealous. I think she fell head over heels for this guy. So much so that she went crazy.
You told me you love me, though.
Don't try to make me the bad guy.
What detectives haven't figured out is whether or not Keon Pittman conspired with Carla to carry out the attack on his fiancée.
But we still feel like he may have been involved with this and knows something.
It's under this dark cloud of uncertainty that the state of Mississippi versus Carla Hughes for the murder of Avis Banks and her unborn child begins. In his opening statement, prosecutor Michael Guest lays out their version of how the crime unfolded.
This defendant had the motive and the means and the opportunity to commit this crime.
According to Guest, it starts at 5:40 p.m. Carla parks her car 100 yards away from Keon and Avis's house. Armed with her cousin's hunting knife and his .38 Special, Carla then sneaks to the back of the residence.
She gained entry into the house by, kicking open a back door.
She staged the house to look like someone had ransacked it and tried to come in and burglarize the home.
Once Carla had set the scene to look like a robbery, she positions herself just inside the door to the garage.
She laid in wait outside that entrance door into the garage until she knew that Avis was getting out of her car.
That's when Carla started firing the gun.
Carla shoots Avis 4 times. Then Carla takes a knife to her victim.
And after Avis was dead, she stabbed her and slashed her neck.
Her being a female and doing it to another female was a very big shock.
After laying out their theory about how the crime unfolded, the state introduces the evidence they've collected against Carla. The murder weapon, the shoe print, and the cell phone records that place her at the crime scene.
We have a significant amount of circumstantial evidence showing that Carla Hughes committed this crime.
As for motive, prosecutor Guest claims that's pretty straightforward. Carla thought she, not Avis, was the one who deserved to be with Keon forever.
Carla Hughes wanted what Avis Banks had, and that was Keon Pittman.
Next, it's the defense's turn, and in their opening statement, Carla's attorney, Johnny Walls, makes a shocking assertion.
The whole defense strategy is that Keon Pittman murdered Avis Banks and framed Carla.
To support their claim, the defense points out that Keon had shoes with a similar tread to Carla, and that in the days leading up to the murder, he had encouraged Carla to obtain a handgun.
He was the one that had suggested that she might need to have a gun or something. He knew about her shoes. He was just in a position to frame her.
As for Keon's possible motive, the defense claims Keon wanted Avis gone so he could maintain his playboy lifestyle.
Although he would have lost a lot by Avis being murdered, he would also have gained a lot by Avis not being around anymore.
As for Keon's alibi that he was coaching basketball practice at the time of the murder, Carla's defense asserts that there was a 30-minute period where his assistant coach ran practice for him.
Keon had an opportunity to leave basketball practice. He had time to commit the crime.
It's an argument that makes for high courtroom drama. But is it enough to get Carla off the hook? Before the jury can answer that question, prosecutors call a surprise witness. A man whose testimony will change the entire dynamic of the case. A man named Keon Pittman. The trial against Carla Hughes for the murder of expectant mother Avis Banks has been nothing short of riveting. The prosecutor began by laying out a mountain of evidence linking Carla to the crime. But the defense countered that Keon Pittman was the killer and that he framed Carla for the crime, which leaves prosecutor Michael Guest with only one option. On October 6th, 2009, he calls Keon to the stand to tell his version of the truth.
We're worried because we know that the defense is going to make him out to be the murderer. But we also know he's the only person that can set the entire scene for the jury.
But no sooner had he taken the stand than Keon breaks down. Or at least tries to.
He's trying to cry. He's not really crying.
The first thing that went through my mind was no tears are falling from your eyes at all.
Keon's tears may seem like bad acting to some, but the story of his affair with Carla Hughes plays like a red-hot romance novel.
What did you think was going on? What did you think was happening?
A sexual adventure.
According to Keon, the affair was hot and heavy from the get-go, but soon Carla wanted more from him than just sex.
She started asking me about Avis and, I guess, me leaving her and different things. And I maintained that would never happen. I would never leave her.
According to Keon, when Carla realized he wasn't going to leave Avis, she became obsessed with him, texting and calling him repeatedly. Carla even faked being pregnant in order to get him to pay attention to her. Keon didn't take the bait.
He tells her, if you come to my house, I'm calling the police.
2 weeks later, Avis is dead. Keon's testimony is powerful, but Carla's defense counters with a withering cross-examination.
I was hoping that he would implicate himself.
Was there anything that stopped you from standing at that door and waiting for her to come in?
There's nothing to stop me, but that's not what I didn't do.
And you did that, didn't you?
No, I did not. No, I did not.
Throughout the testimony, Keon, continued to maintain that he did not kill Avis.
With Keon's riveting turn on the stand complete, both sides rest. But whose story will the jury believe? Keon's or Carla's? Just 8 hours later, they return with their verdict.
Everyone goes back in the courtroom. The jury walks in, and several of them have been crying.
None of us really know what way the jury's leaning.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Carla Hughes, guilty of capital murder as charged.
Avis's family is overjoyed by the verdict.
The only thing I could think of was, thank God.
When the verdict came back and they said Carla was guilty, God is good.
Be sentenced to a term of life imprisonment without parole in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections.
She will live the rest of her natural life in custody. And so it is a death sentence in a way.
As Carla is escorted out of the courtroom and off to prison, she grows increasingly hysterical. Although it's clear her obsession with Keon Pittman led to the murder of Avis Banks, Avis's family, like so many others familiar with the case, isn't sure justice has been completely served.
Keon Pittman is a liar and a betrayer.
He didn't want to have to be tied down and be a husband and be a father and stay in the home with his family. He wanted to be out and be free to be with whoever he wanted to be with. I think most people believe he got away with murder.
There's absolutely no doubt in our mind that Keon Pittman needs to pay a price for something in this crime.
Either way, those closest to the case can't help but wonder, what would have become of Avis Banks, the gentle soul, the beloved teacher, the mother-to-be, had she not been collateral damage in Keon and Carla's torrid, some might say, fatal attraction.
There was no winners in this case. Avis is dead. You know, she never got a chance to live that dream she wanted, raising that child. And Carla Hughes, she's in a prison. You know, they both lost.
The call came in just before sunrise. No name, no hesitation, just a voice, low and shaking, whispering a single sentence before the line went dead. You buried her twice. By the time the dispatcher traced the signal, it was gone. Disposable phone. No prints. No witnesses. Just another ghost brushing past a case that had already haunted Florida for nearly 3 decades. Summer heat choking the air. A quiet coastal town where nothing ever happened, until it did. Until a 23-year-old woman vanished without a trace, leaving behind a locked bedroom, a half-finished cup of coffee, and a diary no one would read for years. Her name didn't make national headlines. Not at first. She was just another missing person in a state that sees too many. But those who knew her said the same thing, over and over. She didn't run. She didn't disappear. She was taken. And yet, there was no sign of struggle. No blood. No forced entry. Just absence.
Clean.
Surgical.
Terrifying.
Police called it a routine disappearance. For the first 48 hours, they treated it like a voluntary walkout. That was the first mistake. By the time they realized something was wrong, the trail had already gone cold.
Cold case.
The words would come later, stamped onto a file that would sit untouched for years. But in those first days, everything still felt urgent. Neighbors were questioned. Friends were brought in. Family members gave statements under flickering fluorescent lights, their voices cracking, repeating the same timeline like a broken record. Last seen the night before. No signs of distress. No known enemies. No explanation. The town began to whisper. Quiet conversations behind closed doors. Curtains drawn tighter than usual. People locking their doors for the first time in years. Because something didn't add up, and everyone could feel it. Her car was still parked outside. Her keys were inside. Her shoes were by the door. It was as if she had been erased mid-step. Days turned into weeks. Search parties combed through marshlands and wooded trails. Divers checked the shallow waters nearby. Helicopters scanned from above, blades slicing through the heavy Florida air. Nothing. Not a single trace. And then came the first strange detail. A neighbor reported seeing a light in her room long after she had supposedly disappeared. Not just once, multiple nights in a row. A flicker. Movement behind curtains that should have been still. Police brushed it off. Faulty memory. Stress. Imagination playing tricks in the dark. But the neighbor insisted. Someone had been inside that house. After she was gone. That detail never made the news. It stayed buried in reports, lost among hundreds of pages of interviews and dead-end leads. Just another anomaly in a case full of them. Months passed. The urgency faded. The search scaled down. Detectives were reassigned. The file grew thicker but colder. Leads dried up. Witnesses forgot small details. The town tried to move on, but something lingered. Because there was one thing investigators couldn't ignore. The diary. It wasn't discovered right away. Not during the initial sweep. Not during the early days when everything still felt solvable. It was found later, tucked behind a loose panel in her closet, hidden so deliberately it almost felt like it was meant to be missed. Inside, page after page of tight, hurried handwriting.
Dates.
Names. Fragments of conversations. And one recurring line, written over and over again in slightly different ways, as if the writer was trying to convince herself it wasn't true. He knows when I'm alone. At first, detectives didn't take it seriously. People write strange things in private. Fear, paranoia, imagination, it all blurs on paper. But the more they read, the harder it became to dismiss. There were entries describing footsteps outside her window, phone calls with no one on the line, objects moved slightly out of place, a feeling, constant, suffocating, that she was being watched. Weeks before her disappearance, the tone changed. The entries became shorter, sharper, more urgent. I saw him today. No name, no description.
Just that.
And then, days later, he's closer than I thought. That line would haunt investigators for years, because it suggested something far worse than a random encounter. It implied familiarity,
proximity,
someone within reach, someone who knew her. The diary was logged as evidence, but without a suspect, it became just another piece of a puzzle with no picture. Leads were followed, names checked, alibis verified. Nothing stuck. Everyone had somewhere to be. Everyone had someone to confirm it. The case stalled. Cold case. Time moved on, but the file didn't. It sat in storage, collecting dust, its edges yellowing, its contents slowly fading into irrelevance. New cases came in. New crimes demanded attention. And the disappearance of a young woman in 1995 became just another unsolved mystery in a growing archive. But not everyone forgot. Her family didn't. They kept asking questions, calling the department, pushing for updates that never came. They held onto the diary like it was a lifeline, reading and rereading the same lines, searching for something, anything, they might have missed. Years passed, then decades.
The town changed.
New buildings replaced old ones. People moved in, unaware of what had happened there before. The house was sold, renovated, repainted, its walls holding secrets no one could see. Until the call came in. You buried her twice. The case file was pulled from storage the same day. Old evidence re-examined. Witnesses tracked down if they were still alive. Technology had changed. Methods had evolved. What had once been invisible might now be seen. And the diary, the forgotten, dismissed, overlooked diary, was placed back under a light for the first time in years. This time, they read it differently. Not as the ramblings of a frightened young woman, but as a warning, a map, a voice reaching out from the past, trying to be heard. And suddenly, the question wasn't just what happened in 1995. It was who had been there all along, watching, waiting, hidden in plain sight. Because if the diary was telling the truth, then the killer had never really left. And the town, for all these years, had been living right beside him. The file hadn't been touched in years, but the moment it was reopened, something shifted, not in the evidence, not in the facts, but in the way every line was read, every silence interpreted, every omission questioned, because what once looked like fragments now felt like intent, like something carefully left behind, waiting for the right moment to be understood. And the diary, once dismissed as paranoia, now sat at the center of it all, no longer a side note but a voice, steady, insistent, impossible to ignore. Detective Aaron Cole had seen cold cases before, hundreds of them, files filled with dust and regret, names that meant nothing anymore, faces that blurred into statistics, but this one was different, not because of what was there, but because of what wasn't, because the absence felt deliberate, like someone had taken the time to remove themselves from the story, to erase every trace, every fingerprint, every mistake, leaving behind only the illusion of nothing, and that kind of precision that wasn't luck, that was control. He started with the diary, page by page, line by line, no shortcuts, no assumptions. Just the words as they were written. At first, it was the repetition that stood out. The same fear, the same presence, the same invisible shadow hovering just beyond reach. But then something else began to surface, something smaller, quieter, buried between the lines like a code waiting to be cracked. Timing. Every entry had a rhythm. Late nights, early mornings, moments when she was alone. And then, scattered among them, references to ordinary interactions, a cashier who looked too long, a man across the street who always seemed to be there, a voice she thought she recognized but couldn't place, details that had been brushed aside before, lost in the noise of a frightened mind, but now, under a different lens, they began to align. Not random, not scattered. Connected. Cole mapped it out.
Dates.
Locations. Cross-referenced with everything that still existed. Old receipts, bank statements, phone records recovered from archives. Anything that could anchor those entries to something real.
Most of it was gone.
Too much time had passed. But not everything. There was one pattern that refused to disappear. A maintenance company.
Small.
Local. Easy to overlook. Their name appeared indirectly. A broken light fixed, a lock replaced, a complaint about wiring, routine service calls that barely registered at the time, but now, when placed against the timeline of her entries, they overlapped with disturbing precision. Every time something in her house was fixed, the diary entries intensified. Every visit followed by days of unease. Every repair followed by that same line, repeated with growing urgency. He knows when I'm alone. Cole dug deeper. Records showed the company had only a handful of employees back in 1995. Names that meant nothing. Men who had moved away, changed jobs, disappeared into the background of ordinary life. One of them was dead. Another couldn't be found. The third still lived in Florida. Same county.
Same town.
That alone wasn't enough. But then came the next detail. The neighbor. The one who had reported seeing light in the victim's room after her disappearance. At the time, her statement had been minimized, almost dismissed, a footnote in a growing pile of inconsistencies. But now, decades later, she was still there, older, quieter, but her memory sharp. She remembered the nights clearly, because it didn't feel like imagination. It felt wrong. The light wasn't steady.
It moved.
From room to room.
Slowly.
Deliberately.
As if someone was searching for something.
Or finishing something they had started. She had almost called the police again back then. Almost. But the fear of being wrong, of being dismissed, had kept her silent. Until now. Cole asked her one question. Did she ever see who it was? She hesitated, then shook her head. But her eyes said something else. Not certainty. Not clarity. But recognition. Like a face seen in passing, too ordinary to remember, too familiar to question. That was enough. The house records were pulled. Ownership history. Renovations. Contractors. Anyone who had access before and after the disappearance. And there it was again. The same maintenance company. Not just before, but after. Weeks after she was gone, a service request had been logged. Electrical issue, second floor. No one had questioned it. The house was still under investigation at the time, but procedures in 1995 weren't what they are now. Things slipped through. People assumed someone else had cleared it. Someone hadn't, which meant that whoever entered that house after her disappearance had a reason. And possibly permission.
Cole felt it then.
That shift. The moment a cold case stops being cold. The moment the past stops being distant and starts breathing again. He went back to the diary. This time looking for something specific. Not fear. Not paranoia. But recognition. And then he saw it.
A name.
Not written clearly. Not directly. Just an initial, buried in a sentence that didn't seem important at first glance. Jay fixed the back door today. Said it was nothing, but I don't believe him.
J.
One letter. One thread. But in a case built on nothing, it was everything. The employee records were incomplete, but one name matched. Jonathan Reeves. No criminal record. No history of violence. No reason to stand out. Just another man who had done his job and moved on. Except he hadn't moved far. Still in the area. Still invisible. Cole didn't rush. Cold cases don't reward haste. They reward patience. Precision. He pulled everything on Reeves. Work history. Financial records. Property ownership. And one detail stood out immediately. In 1996, 1 year after the disappearance, Reeves had purchased land. Not expensive. Not large. But remote. Far enough from town to be forgotten. Close enough to reach in under an hour. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it felt like something else. A place to disappear. A place to hide. A place where questions wouldn't reach. The team moved carefully. No alerts. No noise. Just quiet observation. Because if the diary was right, if the pattern held, then they weren't just looking at a man who had gotten away with something. They were looking at someone who had lived with it. For decades. Unseen. Unchallenged. Untouched. And people like that, they don't stop being dangerous. They just get better at hiding it. The surveillance began. Days turned into weeks. Reeves lived alone. Routine. Predictable. Work. Home. Silence. No visitors. No obvious signs of anything unusual. Just a man aging quietly, blending into the background. But something about it felt controlled. Too clean. Too careful. Like someone who had spent years making sure nothing slipped. And then, just as the case began to feel like it might stall again, they found it. Not in his house. Not on his property. But in a storage unit registered under a different name. Inside boxes. Old. Sealed. Untouched for years. Until now. Cole stood there as they opened the first one. Dust rising into the air. Time breaking open. And inside. Pieces. Fragments. Objects that didn't belong together. Photographs. Clothing. Personal items. All from different times. Different places. Different lives. But one item froze the room. A small worn notebook. The cover faded. Edges curled with age. But unmistakable. The same diary. Or rather, what was left of it. Because the one in evidence wasn't complete. Pages were missing. Torn out. Removed. And now, after all these years, they were here. Hidden. Kept. Like trophies. Like memories. Like proof. Cole didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Because everyone in that room felt it. The weight. The shift. The moment when a mystery begins to collapse under its own truth. Because this wasn't just about a disappearance anymore. This was about something that had been carefully constructed. A story edited over time. A truth divided into pieces. One part left behind. One part taken. And the part that had been taken was finally speaking. But not clearly. Not yet. Because whatever those missing pages contained, they weren't just evidence. They were the reason she never made it out. And somewhere in those lines was the moment everything changed. The moment fear became reality. The moment the cold case stopped being a question and started becoming an answer that no one was ready to hear. The air inside the storage unit didn't move, thick with the weight of something that had waited too long to be found, and as the final pages of the diary were lifted into evidence bags, no one spoke, because the silence itself felt like a warning, like whatever had been hidden here wasn't meant to be read all at once, wasn't meant to be understood in a single glance. But Detective Cole didn't believe in waiting anymore. Not after 30 years. Not after a voice had called in the dark and said, "You buried her twice," because that wasn't just a clue, it was a confession wrapped in accusation, and somewhere between the original diary and the pages that had been taken, there was a fracture, a moment where the story split in two. Back at the lab, the reconstruction began. The original diary, the one found in her house, was placed side by side with the recovered pages from the storage unit, and immediately, the difference was visible, not just in content, but in tone, because the earlier entries were afraid, uncertain, reaching outward for explanation, but the missing pages, they were different, sharper, more focused, like fear had evolved into recognition, like the shadow she had been writing about finally had a face. The first recovered page was dated just 5 days before her disappearance. The handwriting was tighter, pressed harder into the paper. He came back again today. Didn't knock this time. Said he needed to check the wiring, but nothing was broken. I didn't call anyone. No name. But it didn't need one. Cole already knew who he might be. Jonathan Reeves. The man who had access. The man who didn't need to knock. The next page. I asked him how he knew. He just smiled. Said he notices things. Said I shouldn't worry so much. That line lingered in the room longer than it should have. Because it wasn't threatening. Not directly. It was worse. It was casual. controlled. The kind of sentence someone says when they know exactly how much power they have. Cole felt the pattern tightening. This wasn't random. This was an opportunity. This was proximity turned into obsession. And then came the entry that changed everything. Dated 3 days before she vanished. I think he's been inside when I'm gone. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just a statement. Followed by a list. Small things. A chair moved. A window slightly open. A drawer not quite closed the way she remembered. Details that would mean nothing to anyone else. But to her they meant everything. Because they proved something no one had wanted to believe back then. This wasn't just a man watching from the outside. This was someone who had crossed the line. Entered her space. Learned her routines. Studied her life. Cole leaned back, eyes fixed on the page, because suddenly the neighbor's statement made sense. The light moving through the house after she was gone wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake. It was part of something that had already been happening long before she disappeared. Something that had escalated quietly, unnoticed, until it couldn't be ignored anymore. The next page was different. Shorter. 1 sentence. I locked the back door tonight. I checked it twice. Cole didn't need to be told what that meant. He had already seen the earlier entry. Jay fixed the back door today. A fix that might not have been a fix at all. A lock that might not have been secure. A detail so small it would have slipped past any initial investigation. But now it felt deliberate. Constructed. A way in. A way out. The following entry was the last complete page. Dated the night before she disappeared. The handwriting was uneven. Rushed. Almost frantic. He knows I'm writing this. The room went still. No one moved. No one breathed. Because that line didn't belong to fear anymore. It belonged to certainty. To the realization that whatever had been watching her had crossed into something far more dangerous. And then, beneath it, barely legible, as if written in a moment of hesitation, if anything happens to me, it's... The sentence ended there. Cut off.
Not by time.
Not by fading ink.
But by force.
The rest of the page was torn clean. And that missing piece had been sitting in a box for 30 years. Cole didn't wait. He opened the evidence bag containing the fragment.
Carefully. Slowly.
As if the paper itself might break under the weight of what it carried. The torn edges matched perfectly. There was no doubt. This was the continuation. The final line she had ever written. And as he placed it against the original page, completing the sentence that had been interrupted for decades, the truth emerged in a way that was both undeniable and devastating. If anything happens to me, it's him.
JR.
No ambiguity. No confusion. Just 2 letters. A name reduced to initials, but now fully realized. Jonathan Reeves. The room shifted. Not physically, but emotionally. Because in that moment, the case stopped being a mystery. It became a timeline. A sequence of decisions. A path that had been laid out clearly, ignored once, but impossible to ignore now. Cole closed his eyes for a second, just long enough to let the weight settle, because this wasn't just evidence, it was a voice that had been cut off mid-sentence, finally allowed to finish what it had tried to say all those years ago. But one question remained. If she knew, if she wrote it down, why hadn't it been enough? The answer came from the same place it always does in cases like this. Timing. The diary hadn't been found until after she was gone. The accusation had never been heard. And Reeves had walked free. For decades. Cole stood up. No more waiting. No more observation. They had enough. More than enough. The storage unit. The missing pages. The direct implication. And the pattern that tied it all together. But as they prepared to move, another detail surfaced, one that hadn't been fully understood until now. The phrase from the call. You buried her twice. At first, it sounded metaphorical. Emotional. But now it didn't. Because if Reeves had taken pages from the diary, if he had gone back into the house after her disappearance, if he had tried to control the narrative even after she was gone, then maybe what had been buried once had been moved, relocated, hidden again. The land he purchased in 1996. 1 year after. Remote. Isolated. Untouched. It wasn't just property. It was a possibility. A second burial. The team didn't say it out loud. They didn't need to. Because the implication was already there, heavy in the air, pressing down on every decision that came next. This wasn't just about proving what happened. It was about finding what had been hidden for 30 years. And if the voice on the phone was telling the truth, then the ground itself was about to become evidence. Cole grabbed the file. The diary. The fragment that had completed a sentence left unfinished for decades. And as he stepped out of the room, one thought followed him. Persistent, unshakable. She had tried to tell them. She had written it down. She had left a name. And still, it hadn't been enough to save her. But now, after all this time, it might be enough to bring everything else to the surface. Because somewhere out there, beneath soil that had never been questioned, beneath silence that had lasted far too long, the truth was still waiting. And this time, it wasn't going to stay buried. The land didn't look like much. That was the first thing everyone noticed when they finally stood at the edge of it. No fences, no warning signs, no obvious attempt to keep anyone out, just a stretch of dry earth broken by patches of stubborn grass, and a line of trees that cut across the horizon like a scar, the kind of place no one would think twice about driving past, the kind of place that didn't invite attention. And maybe that was the point, because the best hiding places aren't the ones that are concealed, they're the ones that feel too ordinary to question. Jonathan Reeves had owned it for 30 years. 3 decades of silence. 3 decades of no one asking why a man with no clear reason would buy land he never developed, never sold, never spoke about, just kept quietly, like a secret he didn't need to share. Cole stepped forward first, boots pressing into soil that hadn't been disturbed in any meaningful way for years, but the team behind him already knew what they were looking for. Not something obvious, not a grave marked by desperation, but something subtler, something controlled, because everything they had seen so far pointed to one truth. Reeves didn't make mistakes. He planned, he adjusted, he erased. And yet someone had called. You buried her twice. That wasn't random. That wasn't guesswork. That was knowledge. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in before a single shovel touched the earth. Slow passes sweeping across the property, scanning beneath the surface, translating layers of soil into patterns, disturbances, anomalies that the naked eye could never catch. And for a while, it showed nothing, just the natural inconsistencies of land left alone too long. Roots, rocks, pockets of air. The kind of noise that hides everything and reveals nothing. Then, near the tree line, something shifted. A shape. Faint at first. Then clearer. A section of soil that didn't match the rest. Not in density, not in structure, not in history.
Disturbed. Once.
Maybe twice. Cole didn't say anything, but he felt it, that tightening in the chest, that quiet confirmation that they were no longer chasing a theory, they were standing on top of it. The excavation began slowly.
Carefully.
Layer by layer. Because after 30 years, evidence doesn't just disappear, it transforms, it settles into the earth, becomes part of it, and pulling it back out requires patience, precision, respect for what might still be there. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun climbed higher. The air grew heavier. No one spoke unless they had to, because every movement felt like it mattered. Every inch closer to something that had been hidden too long. And then the first sign. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just a change in color. Soil darker than the rest. Compact. Unnatural. The kind of detail you only notice when you're looking for it. Tools slowed. Hands became more deliberate. Because this was the point where mistakes couldn't be undone. Another few inches. And then it came into view. Fabric. Faded. Fragile. But unmistakable. Cole closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to register what it meant, because this wasn't speculation anymore, this wasn't a possibility, this was confirmation, physical, undeniable, buried beneath decades of silence. The dig stopped. For a moment no one moved. The weight of it settled over the site, heavy, irreversible. Then procedure took over. Forensics stepped in. Documentation. Photography. Every angle captured, every detail preserved, because once something like this is exposed, it changes everything, not just the case, but the story, the timeline, the truth that had been missing for so long. As more of it was uncovered, the shape became clearer. Remains. Positioned deliberately. Not discarded. Not rushed. Placed. That detail mattered. Because it spoke to intent, to control, to a mind that didn't act in panic, but in calculation. But then came the second anomaly. A few feet away from the first sight. Another disturbance. Subtler. Harder to detect. But now impossible to ignore. Cole felt the words from the call echo again. Louder this time, sharper, cutting through the silence. You buried her twice. The radar was adjusted. Focused on that second area. And there it was. Another shape. Shallower. Different. Not a body. Something else. The team shifted position. New markers placed. A second excavation began. Faster this time, but no less careful, because whatever this was, it had been put there for a reason, not as an afterthought, but as part of the same story. The soil gave way more easily, less compact, less settled. And then, within minutes, they found it. A container. Metal. Sealed. Weathered by time, but still intact. Cole stepped closer as it was lifted out, dirt falling away in quiet cascades, revealing edges that had been hidden for decades, edges that now felt sharper than they should, as if time had preserved them for this exact moment. No one opened it right away, because whatever was inside had been meant to stay there. But the case had already crossed a line. There was no going back. The seal was broken. Slowly. Carefully. And as the lid came free, the past came with it. Inside, more items. Personal. Deliberate. A collection that didn't belong together unless someone had put them there with intention. Photographs. Not random. Not found. Taken. Some of them blurred, distant, others closer, clearer, angles that suggested observation, not memory. And in several of them, her. Unaware. Unposed. Living her life without realizing she was being watched. The room tightened again, even out here in the open air, because this wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was evidence of something that had been building long before that night, something that had crossed from curiosity into fixation, from presence into intrusion. And then beneath the photographs, another set of pages. Not from her diary. Different handwriting. Messier. Unstructured, but unmistakably connected. Notes. Observations. Times. Dates. Movements tracked with disturbing precision. What time she left. When she returned. How long lights stayed on. Patterns mapped out over weeks, maybe months. Cole didn't need to read all of it to understand. This wasn't a moment. This was a process. A slow, deliberate escalation that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. And then, at the very bottom of the container, one final item. A key. Old. Worn. Tagged with a number that matched nothing at first glance, but something about it felt wrong, out of place, like it belonged somewhere it shouldn't, like it opened something that hadn't been considered yet. Cole picked it up, turning it slightly in the light, the metal catching the sun just enough to reveal the faint engraving along its side. Not a house key. Not a car key. Something else. Something specific. And suddenly, the timeline shifted again. Because if there was a key, then there was a lock. And if there was a lock, then there was a place. Another place. Somewhere this hadn't ended. Somewhere it might have continued. The land fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, more complete, because what they had uncovered wasn't just the truth about what had happened in 1995. It was proof that the story didn't stop there, that whatever Reeves had done, however carefully he had hidden it, it had layers, it had depth, it had parts that were still missing. Cole looked back at the first excavation site, at the remains that had finally been brought back into the light after 30 years, and for a moment, it felt like closure, like the end of something that had been waiting too long. But then he looked at the key again, and he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the first thing Reeves had buried. And somewhere else, there was more. The key didn't belong to the land. That was the first conclusion they reached, Not through instinct, but through elimination, because every lock on the property had already been cataloged, every structure inspected, every rusted hinge and forgotten latch tested against it, and nothing matched, which meant the key pointed somewhere else, somewhere separate from the burial site, somewhere that hadn't been disturbed in 30 years. And that realization shifted the weight of the investigation again, pulling it away from the ground. They had just opened and toward a space that still existed, still intact, still holding whatever Reeves had chosen not to bury. Cole held the key longer than necessary, turning it between his fingers, feeling the grooves, the wear, the subtle indentations that only come from repeated use. Because this wasn't a spare, it wasn't a backup, it was something that had mattered, something that had been used often enough to leave marks, and that meant whatever it opened had been part of his routine. Back at the station, the process began. The number etched into the tag was run through every system still available, cross-referenced with records that had barely survived the transition from paper to digital, storage facilities, lockers, safety deposit boxes, anything that might correspond to a coded key. But for hours, nothing came back, just dead ends, outdated formats, missing files, the kind of gaps time creates when no one is looking closely enough. But Cole didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Not in this case. Not after everything they had found. He shifted focus. Not the key itself, but the man who carried it. Jonathan Reeves. Routine. Patterns. Habits that don't disappear just because time passes. Financial records were pulled again, this time with a narrower lens, looking for repetition, for consistency, for anything that had remained unchanged over decades, and that's when it surfaced, buried in transactions so small they had been overlooked before. Monthly payments. Same amount. Same date. For years. Then decades. Always on time. Always consistent. A storage facility. Not the one they had already searched. Another. Older. Further out. The kind of place that doesn't advertise, doesn't update its systems, doesn't ask questions as long as the payments keep coming. Cole didn't wait for confirmation. He didn't need it. Because the moment he saw the pattern, he knew. This was it. The lock that matched the key. The place that hadn't been touched. Not yet. The drive there felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of what might be waiting at the end of it, because every step forward in this case had revealed something worse than the last, something more deliberate, more controlled, more unsettling, and there was no reason to believe this would be any different. The facility looked exactly the way it felt, forgotten. Rows of metal doors, paint peeling, numbers barely visible, the air heavy with dust and neglect, the kind of place where time doesn't move forward, it just sits, accumulating layer by layer, until everything feels suspended between past and present. The manager was older. Didn't remember much. Didn't need to. Records were enough. Unit number matched the key. No activity logged in years. No access requests. Just payments. Always paid. Always on time. As if whoever owned it didn't need to visit because whatever was inside had already been left exactly the way they wanted it. Cole stood in front of the door for a moment, the key resting in his palm, heavier now than it had been before, not because of its size, but because of what it represented, a final step into a space that had been sealed off from the world for 30 years. He didn't rush. Cold cases don't end with sudden movements. They end with quiet confirmations. The key slid into the lock. Fit perfectly. Of course it did. A slight turn. A click that sounded louder than it should have. And then nothing. For a second, it felt like the door itself was resisting, like whatever was behind it didn't want to be opened, didn't want to be seen, but then the mechanism gave, metal shifting against metal, and the seal that had held for decades finally broke. The door lifted slowly. Light cutting into darkness. Dust rising in the air like something disturbed from a long sleep. At first, it looked empty. Just space. Just shadows. But then shapes began to form. Objects. Arranged. Not stored. Not abandoned. Placed. Deliberately. Cole stepped inside. Every instinct telling him to move carefully, not because of physical danger, but because of what this place represented, a controlled environment, untouched by time, preserved exactly as Reeves had left it.
The walls were lined, not with shelves,
with images.
Dozens of them. Hundreds.
Photographs pinned in uneven rows, overlapping, layered, forming a collage that felt less like documentation and more like obsession made visible. And at the center of it all, her. Every angle, every moment, walking, talking, standing by her car, looking out a window, living a life she didn't know was being recorded piece by piece.
Cole didn't speak.
No one did, because the room itself said everything. This wasn't just surveillance. This was fixation. Extended, refined, perfected over time. And it didn't stop with her. Other faces appeared in the edges. Different women, different times. Some clearer than others. Some barely visible. But enough to suggest something far worse than a single target. A pattern. A progression. The air grew heavier with each step deeper into the unit, because the further they moved, the more it became clear that this wasn't a place where something had ended. It was a place where something had been maintained, preserved, revisited in silence. And then in the far corner, a desk. Simple, unremarkable, but positioned in a way that suggested use, not storage. Cole approached it slowly, every movement measured, because whatever sat there had been left intentionally.
On top of it, a notebook.
Not hers. Not the same as the one from the container. This one was thicker, worn from handling, edges darkened by time and touch. He opened it. The first page was blank. The second wasn't. Handwriting. The same as the notes from the container.
Reeves.
No doubt now. Entries began as observations.
Times.
Distances. Routines. But as the pages turned, they changed. Language shifted. From watching to planning. From distance to proximity. And then to control. Cole felt it again. That shift. The moment when something crosses a line it can't come back from. And buried deep within those pages, between lines that detailed movements no one should have known, between notes that tracked a life that wasn't his to follow, there was a single entry that stood apart. Dated the night she disappeared.
Short.
Precise. Chilling in its simplicity.
She finally let me in.
The room went silent again. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence, the kind that comes from understanding. Because that one line destroyed every remaining doubt. This hadn't been forced. Not in the way anyone had assumed. The lock. The repairs. The familiarity. The presence that had been building over weeks, maybe months. He hadn't needed to break in. He had been invited. Not knowingly. Not willingly. But gradually.
Carefully.
Until the line between stranger and something else had blurred just enough. And once he was inside, everything changed. Cole closed the notebook slowly, the weight of it settling into his hands, because this wasn't just evidence anymore, it was a narrative, written from the other side, from the perspective that had been missing for 30 years, the perspective that explained not just what happened but how it had been allowed to happen. And as he looked around the unit one more time, at the walls, the photographs, the careful arrangement of a life that had never belonged to the man who documented it, one thought cut through everything else, sharp and unavoidable. This didn't start in 1995. And it didn't end there either. Because if this place was what Reeves chose to keep, then somewhere else, there were things he chose to hide. The room didn't feel like evidence. It felt like memory, not the kind that fades, not the kind that softens over time, but the kind that sharpens, that fixes itself in place, that refuses to let go. And standing inside that storage unit, surrounded by images that had never been meant to be seen, Detective Cole understood something that hadn't been clear before, something that shifted the entire weight of the case from a single act to something far more disturbing, far more deliberate, because this wasn't just about what Reeves had done, it was about how long he had been preparing to do it. The notebook stayed in Cole's hands as the team moved methodically through the unit, cataloging, documenting, preserving everything exactly as it had been found, but every page he had already read was enough to redraw the timeline, to push the beginning further back, to suggest that the disappearance in 1995 wasn't the start of the story. It was the moment the story could no longer stay hidden. Reeves hadn't rushed. That was clear now. He had watched, waited, learned, Every habit, every routine, every small detail that most people would never notice, he had recorded, refined, turned into a system, and systems like that don't form overnight. They take time, repetition, patience, the kind of patience that doesn't break under pressure because it doesn't feel like pressure, it feels like control. Cole flipped deeper into the notebook. Entries from before 1995. Months earlier. Then years. Different names appeared, some crossed out, some left incomplete, but always followed by the same pattern: observation, proximity, escalation, and then nothing, as if something had interrupted the process, or as if the process itself had been abandoned before it reached its final stage. Except for her. Her name appeared differently. Not written in full. Just initials at first. Then references. Then details that grew more frequent, more precise, more focused, until she wasn't just one entry among many. She became the center of it all, the point where observation turned into intention. And that was the difference. That was what separated her case from everything else. She hadn't just been watched. She had been chosen. The realization settled in slowly, but once it did, it couldn't be ignored, because it meant that everything that followed, every step, every decision, every moment leading up to that night, had been shaped by that choice. Cole's attention shifted back to the photographs on the walls, seeing them differently now, not just as evidence of surveillance, but as stages, phases of something that had been building long before anyone knew it existed. Distance. Medium range.
Close.
Inside. The progression was visible if you knew how to look. And then it stopped. Abruptly. No images after that final phase. No continuation. Because after that point, there was nothing left to document. One of the technicians called out from the far side of the unit, breaking the silence just enough to draw attention, and when Cole stepped closer, he saw what they had found. Something smaller, less obvious than the rest, but no less important. A box. Not hidden. Not sealed. Just placed beneath the desk, as if it hadn't needed to be concealed because it had never been meant to be discovered.
Inside tapes.
Old. Labeled only with dates. Some from 1995. Others from earlier. No descriptions. No context. Just time, recorded without explanation. Cole felt that familiar tightening again because in cases like this, recordings don't exist without purpose, they don't get made without intent, and whatever was on those tapes had been captured for a reason. The equipment to play them wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. Reeves hadn't needed it here. This place wasn't for revisiting. It was for keeping, preserving, holding on to something without ever having to face it again. The tapes were bagged, tagged, removed. But their presence lingered, heavier than the photographs, heavier than the notes, because images can be explained, written words can be interpreted, but recordings capture moments exactly as they happened, without filter, without distortion. And whatever those moments were, they had been important enough to keep. Cole stepped back, taking in the entire unit one last time because there was a pattern to everything here, a logic that had been followed carefully, consistently, and now that they had seen it, it couldn't be unseen. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't impulse. This was structure. And structures like this don't exist in isolation. They extend. They connect. They lead somewhere. The question was where. Reeves was brought in that afternoon. No resistance. No surprise. Just compliance. As if he had always known this moment would come, as if the decades in between had just been time borrowed, not time earned. He sat across from Cole in a room that felt too small for the weight it carried, hands resting calmly on the table, eyes steady, unreadable, not defiant, not nervous, just present. Cole didn't start with accusations. He didn't need to. He started with silence, letting it stretch, letting it settle. Because people like Reeves, they fill silence eventually, not because they have to, but because they want to control what breaks it. And when Reeves finally spoke, his voice was exactly what Cole expected.
Calm.
Measured. Almost detached. You found the unit. Not a question. A statement. Cole didn't respond. Didn't confirm. Didn't deny. Just watched. Because this wasn't about information anymore. It was about behavior. About what Reeves chose to say, and what he didn't. Reeves continued. I wonder how long it would take. There was no fear in it. No urgency, just curiosity. As if the entire investigation was something he had been observing from a distance, the same way he had observed everything else. Cole leaned forward slightly. "The diary," he said, voice steady, controlled. "You missed a page." For the first time, something shifted.
Small.
Almost imperceptible.
But there.
A flicker. Not panic. Not even surprise. Just recognition. Reeves exhaled slowly, eyes dropping for a fraction of a second before returning to Cole. "I didn't miss it," he said. "I kept it." The room tightened, because that one correction changed everything. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. Cole didn't break eye contact. "Why go back?" he asked, after she was gone. Reeves tilted his head slightly, considering the question, not as if he didn't understand it, but as if he was deciding how much of the answer to give. "Because stories matter," he said finally. "And I didn't like how hers ended." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been, because they weren't defensive, they weren't apologetic, they were editorial, as if what had happened wasn't just an act, but a narrative he had been shaping, adjusting, refining even after it was over. Cole felt it then, clearer than ever. This wasn't about hiding. It was about control. Over what happened. Over how it was remembered. Over what was left behind. And if Reeves had gone back to the house, if he had taken pages, if he had altered the story, then the second burial wasn't just physical. It was narrative. A truth buried once in the ground. And again in silence. Cole leaned back slightly, letting the realization settle, because the case had crossed another line, from evidence into psychology, from what happened into why it happened, and those answers, they don't come easily. But they leave traces. In words. In patterns. In the way someone chooses to remember their own actions. Reeves watched him quietly, that same calm expression never fully breaking, but something had changed in the room, something subtle, something that suggested the balance had shifted, not completely, not yet, but enough to matter. Because for the first time in 30 years, Reeves wasn't the only one holding the full story. And somewhere between the diary, the land, the storage unit, and the tapes waiting to be heard, the rest of it was still out there, waiting to speak. The tapes didn't wait. They couldn't. Because in cases like this, time doesn't just erase evidence. It distorts it, degrades it, turns clarity into fragments, and whatever was recorded on those reels had already survived 3 decades in silence, sealed in a box that was never meant to be opened again. And now that it was, every second mattered. Every delay risked losing something that might never be recovered. The lab worked through the night. Old equipment had to be sourced, calibrated, adjusted to handle formats that hadn't been used in years, formats that belonged to a different era, a different way of capturing the world, one that didn't rely on digital precision but on magnetic memory, fragile, imperfect, but honest in a way that modern systems aren't. Cole stood behind the glass as the first tape was loaded. No one spoke. No one moved. Because whatever was about to play had been recorded without an audience. And now it had one. The machine clicked. A low hum filled the room. Static at first. Just noise. Distorted, uneven, like something trying to find its shape again after years of being buried in silence. Then sound.
Faint. Distant.
A room. Air moving. A subtle echo that suggested walls, enclosed space, something familiar, but not yet identifiable. And then, a voice. Her voice.
Soft.
Uncertain. "Hello." The room tightened instantly, every person inside it pulled forward by that single word, because it wasn't just audio, it was presence, it was proof, it was a moment pulled directly from the past and placed into the present without warning.
Cole didn't blink. Couldn't.
Because the next sound came quickly. Footsteps. Not hers. Heavier. Measured. Approaching. The audio crackled slightly, the limitations of the medium distorting the edges, but not enough to hide what mattered. A second voice.
Male. Come.
Familiar. "You said I could come in." Silence followed. Not empty. Loaded. Because whatever she felt in that moment, it was there, in the pause, in the hesitation that stretched just long enough to be noticed. "I didn't mean, I thought you were." Her voice cut off, interrupted not by force, but by proximity. The sound of movement. Closer now. Too close. You worry too much, the man said, tone unchanged, almost reassuring, almost normal, the kind of voice that doesn't raise alarms until it's already too late. Cole felt his jaw tighten, because he had heard that tone before. In the interview room. From Reeves. The tape continued. No sudden violence. No immediate escalation. Just conversation. Controlled. Uneven. Her responses short, uncertain, his steady, guiding, redirecting, shifting the rhythm of the interaction until it no longer felt like two people speaking, but one person leading and another trying to keep up. Minutes passed like that. Tension building not through action, but through imbalance. And then,
A sound.
subtle, but unmistakable. A lock.
Clicking.
From the inside. The room inside the lab didn't move, but something inside it shifted, something heavy, something final, because that sound didn't just mark a moment. It marked a boundary, a line crossed quietly, deliberately, without resistance. Her voice came again.
Different now.
Lower. Tighter. Why did you lock the door? No answer at first. Just silence. Then, so, we won't be interrupted. The words landed flat, almost casual, but the effect was immediate because from that point on, everything changed, not in volume, not in pace, but in weight, in the way every second that followed felt heavier than the last. The tape crackled again. Movement. Closer. A shift in space that didn't need to be seen to be understood. Her breathing changed.
Faster.
Less controlled. You need to leave, she said, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a clear line drawn, but it came too late, far too late. Reeves didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter, almost reflective. I've been here before, you know. The statement hung there, unchallenged, unanswered, because it didn't need a response. It was a revelation, a confirmation of everything the diary had tried to say, everything that had been dismissed back then as fear or imagination. I know where everything is. Another pause. Longer this time. And then, you shouldn't have written about me. The room inside the lab froze.
Completely.
Because that line, that one sentence connected everything. The diary. The missing pages. The return to the house after she was gone. It wasn't just about control. It was about discovery. He had found it. He had read it. And whatever came after that wasn't part of the plan. The tape distorted briefly, the sound warping as if the machine itself struggled to carry what came next, but the voices were still there, overlapping now, her words sharper, louder, his still controlled but firmer, the balance shifting again, but not in her favor. You went through my things? You were hiding things from me. I don't even know you.
A beat.
And then, almost softly, you do. The way he said it, it wasn't a threat. It was a belief. And that made it worse. Because it meant that whatever he had constructed in his mind, whatever version of reality he had been living in, it didn't match hers. It didn't need to, because to him it was already real. The struggle came next. Not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. Movement. A chair scraping. A sharp intake of breath. And then, the tape cut. Not gradually, not fading. Just stopped. Abrupt. Final. Like a sentence interrupted. Like a moment that didn't get to finish. The machine continued to spin for a few seconds before the technician shut it off. The silence that followed heavier than anything that had come before, because now they knew not just what had happened, but how it had happened, how it had sounded, how it had unfolded in real time without anyone there to stop it. Cole stepped back slowly, his reflection faint in the glass, overlaying the room where the tape had played, and for a moment, it felt like time had collapsed in on itself, like 1995 wasn't 3 decades ago. It was just behind a door that had finally been opened. But one tape wasn't enough. There were more. And if this was just one moment, then the rest of them might tell the parts no one had ever seen. Cole didn't turn away, didn't speak, just gave a single nod. The next tape was already being prepared. Because whatever came next, they needed to hear it. All of it. No matter how long it had been buried. no matter how hard it was to listen, because somewhere in those recordings was the rest of the story Reeves had tried to control. And now, he wasn't the one deciding how it ended. The second tape didn't begin with voices. It began with silence. Not static, not distortion, not the mechanical hum of aging equipment, but a deeper kind of silence, one that felt intentional, like the recorder had been switched on and left waiting, capturing nothing but the absence of sound, and somehow that made it worse, because it meant there had been a moment, a decision to press record before anything happened, a choice to document what was coming. The machine clicked softly as the reel turned. Seconds passed. Then a minute. No one in the lab moved, because silence like that isn't empty. It builds. It stretches. It forces you to listen harder, to lean in, to anticipate something you don't want to hear. And then,
a sound. Faint.
Rhythmic. Not footsteps. Not movement. Something else. Cole narrowed his eyes slightly, focusing, isolating the noise from the background, and as it repeated, slower than breathing, heavier than wind, it became clear.
Digging.
Metal against soil. A dull, consistent impact. Again. And again. And again. The implications settled immediately. This wasn't before. This was after. The tape didn't capture the moment of violence. It captured what came next. The part no one had ever seen. The part Reeves had chosen to record. The digging continued for several seconds, maybe longer, time losing its shape in the repetition, until it stopped abruptly, replaced by a different sound. Fabric shifting, something heavy being moved, dragged slightly, then lowered. No words. Not yet. Just action. Deliberate. Measured. As if even this part had been planned. Cole felt the weight of it pressing down harder now because the first tape had shown interaction, tension, escalation, but this was completion. This was the end of a process that had been building for months, maybe years, and Reeves hadn't just done it. He had documented it, preserved it, as if the act itself wasn't enough, as if he needed a record, something to return to, something to hold on to. Then finally,
his voice.
Quieter than before. Not strained. Not panicked. Just present. You shouldn't have made it complicated. The words were directed at no one. Or maybe at her. Or maybe at himself. It was impossible to tell. Another pause. Then, I gave you time. The sentence lingered longer than it should have, because it reframed everything, twisted the narrative into something unrecognizable, as if what had happened wasn't forced, wasn't taken, but allowed, delayed, inevitable in his mind. Cole's hands tightened slightly at his sides, but he didn't look away.
Couldn't.
Because every second of this mattered now, not just as evidence, but as understanding, as insight into a perspective that had remained hidden for 30 years. The tape continued. More movement. Closer this time. A shift in sound that suggested proximity to the recorder itself, like Reeves had stepped toward it, like he knew it was there, like he was aware of what he was capturing. You were almost ready. The calm in his voice didn't break. Not once. No hesitation. No second-guessing. Just certainty. The kind that doesn't come from impulse, but from belief. And that belief was what made everything else possible. A faint sound followed. Something small. Metal. Then a click. The same sound from the first tape. A lock. But this time it wasn't a door. It was something else.
Contained.
Enclosed. The digging resumed briefly. Then stopped again. And then, silence. Longer than before. Heavier. Final. The tape ran for several more seconds before ending, but nothing else came through. Just the empty sound of space, as if whatever had happened next didn't need to be recorded. The machine clicked off. No one spoke. Not immediately. Because there are moments when words don't add anything, when the weight of what's been heard fills the room completely, leaving no space for interpretation, no room for doubt. Cole exhaled slowly, the air in his chest feeling heavier than it should, because this wasn't just confirmation, it was reconstruction. It was the missing piece that connected the beginning to the end, the diary to the land, the fear to the reality. But something still didn't align. Not fully. Because the phrase echoed again, louder now, impossible to ignore. You buried her twice. The second tape had shown burial.
1. Clear.
Undeniable. But the second wasn't here. Not yet. Which meant there was more. Another layer. Another step. Cole turned slightly, looking at the remaining tapes on the table, each one labeled only with a date, each one holding something that hadn't been heard in decades, something that might explain the part of the story that still didn't make sense. He didn't hesitate this time. Next one, he said, voice low, controlled. The third tape was loaded. Faster now. Less ceremony. Because whatever was left needed to be uncovered before it slipped away again. The reel turned. Static. Brief. Then,
sound.
Different from the others. Enclosed but not the same space. Tighter. More confined. Air thicker. And then, a noise that didn't belong to movement or environment. A voice.
Weak. Strained.
But unmistakable. Her. The room froze again, but this time it wasn't just tension, it was shock, sharp and immediate, because the timeline they had begun to understand, the sequence they had started to piece together, had just been disrupted. Because if this was recorded after the digging, then what they thought they knew wasn't complete. Her voice came again.
Faint.
Barely above a whisper. I can't. The rest faded into something indistinct, but it didn't matter because the implication was already there, heavy, undeniable, rewriting everything in real time. Cole stepped closer to the glass without realizing it, his focus narrowing, locking onto every sound, every breath, every fragment of audio that could explain what they were hearing. A second voice followed. Reeves. Quieter than before. Closer. You're fine, he said. And for the first time there was something different in his tone. Not panic. Not urgency. But something else. Something colder. Something that didn't belong to reassurance. It belonged to control. To continuation. The tape crackled. Her breathing shallow. Irregular. And then, a new sound. Mechanical. Subtle. But distinct. A lid. Opening. Or closing. It was hard to tell. But it didn't matter. Because suddenly the phrase made sense. Not metaphorically. Not symbolically. Literally. You buried her twice. The first burial wasn't the end. Cole felt it hit all at once, the realization cutting through everything they had built so far, because whatever Reeves had done, however carefully he had planned it, it hadn't followed the path anyone had assumed. The timeline wasn't linear. It was layered. And somewhere between those layers was the truth they hadn't fully uncovered yet. The tape continued for a few more seconds. Her voice fading. His voice steady. And then, it ended. Abrupt. Like the others. But this time the silence that followed wasn't just heavy. It was fractured. Because the story they thought they were uncovering had just broken open again. And what was inside was far worse than anything they had expected. The room didn't recover from the third tape. It couldn't. Because what they had just heard didn't just add to the timeline, it shattered it, split it into something uneven, something unstable, something that refused to line up the way it should. And in that fracture, a new possibility emerged, one that was darker, more complex, more difficult to accept, because it meant the story they thought they understood wasn't finished in the ground. Cole didn't speak right away. He let the silence sit, not because he needed time to think, but because everyone else did, because the implication had to land fully before they could move forward, before they could adjust their understanding to something that no longer followed a straight line. You buried her twice. The phrase echoed again, no longer cryptic, no longer abstract, but still incomplete, because now they knew the first burial hadn't been final. They knew there had been a second stage, something that happened after the ground was closed, something that involved containment, confinement, continuation. But where? The land had already been searched. The remains had been found. So the second place was somewhere else. Cole turned back to the board, to the map that had been rebuilt piece by piece over the last few hours, every known location marked, every movement traced, every connection drawn as tightly as possible. But now he looked at it differently, not as a series of points, but as a path, a route that had been followed deliberately. House. Storage unit. Land. But there was a gap. A missing space between the first burial And whatever came next, the key had led them to the storage unit. The land had revealed the remains. But nothing yet explained the voice on that third tape. Nothing accounted for the time between those moments. Unless Cole's eyes shifted back to Reeves' financial records, not looking for payments this time, but for absence, for something that didn't show up because it didn't need to, something that had been owned, controlled, accessed without leaving a trail.
Property.
Not purchased in 1996. Earlier. Before the disappearance. Before everything escalated. And then he saw it, buried in an old record, easy to miss unless you knew what you were looking for. A lease. Short-term. Paid in cash. An address just outside town. Abandoned now. Unregistered. Forgotten. The kind of place that doesn't exist unless you're searching for it. Cole didn't hesitate. Because this wasn't speculation anymore. This was alignment. The missing piece in a sequence that was finally starting to take shape. The drive out was faster this time. Less uncertainty. More urgency. Because if the third tape had been recorded there, if that voice had come from that space, then whatever was left might still be there. Or at least traces of it. The structure was barely standing. Weathered. Collapsed in places. Nature reclaiming what had been left behind. But the foundation held. And sometimes that's enough. Cole stepped inside first. Flashlight cutting through darkness that hadn't been disturbed in years, maybe decades. The beam catching particles in the air, dust that moved slowly, reluctantly, as if the space itself resisted being seen again. The smell hit immediately. Not fresh. Not obvious.
But there. Old. Trapped.
Lingering in the walls, in the floor, in the air itself. The kind of presence that doesn't disappear completely, no matter how much time passes. The team moved carefully, scanning, documenting, but it didn't take long before they found it. Not hidden. Not buried.
Just there.
A section of the floor that didn't match the rest. Newer wood. Replaced at some point. Poorly.
Rushed.
As if whatever had been done beneath it hadn't been meant to last, just meant to hold long enough. Cole crouched down, running his hand lightly over the surface, feeling the difference, the subtle give that shouldn't have been there, and he didn't need to say anything, because everyone else saw it too. The boards were removed.
Slowly. Carefully.
And as the first one came loose, the space beneath it opened just enough to reveal what had been hidden there for 30 years. Not a grave. Not exactly. A compartment. Constructed.
Contained.
Lined with material that had long since degraded but still hinted at its purpose, still held the shape of what it had once enclosed. Cole felt it before he fully saw it. That tightening. That recognition. Because this matched the sound. The lid. The confinement. The second place. The second burial. Inside, there were no remains. Not anymore. But there were traces. Fibers. Fragments. Evidence that something had been there long enough to leave an imprint, long enough to become part of the space itself. And then near the edge, something small, missable, unless you were looking closely. A piece of metal.
Thin. Curved.
Cole picked it up carefully, turning it in the light, and as the dust fell away, the shape became clear. A clasp. From jewelry. Delicate. Broken. And suddenly the image shifted again. Because this wasn't just a place where something had been kept. It was a place where something had been held.
Contained. Alive.
The third tape wasn't after the burial. It was between. Between the first and the second. Between the act and the conclusion. Reeves hadn't just taken her. He had kept her. For how long the tapes might tell. For what reason the notebook already suggested. Control. Completion. A process that didn't end when it should have. Cole stood up slowly, the weight of it settling deeper now, heavier than anything before, because this wasn't just murder, it was extension, it was time stretched unnaturally, it was a sequence that refused to end when it was supposed to. You buried her twice. Now it was complete. First the ground, then this, or the other way around. The order almost didn't matter anymore, because both had happened. Both had been part of the same plan. The same control, the same need to shape not just the act but the time around it. Cole looked around the space one more time, flashlight tracing the edges, the walls, the ceiling that had held this secret for decades, and for a moment, it felt like the past was still there, not as memory but as presence, something that hadn't fully left, something that had been waiting for someone to come back and understand what had been done here. And then he stepped back, because now they knew. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to see the shape of it. Enough to hear the story behind the silence. Enough to understand that what Reeves had built wasn't just a crime. It was a sequence. And every part of that sequence had finally been brought back into the light. But one thing still remained. One question that hadn't been answered. The call. The voice that had started all of this. Because whoever had said those words had known. Not guessed. Not suspected.
Known.
And that meant one final piece of the story was still out there. One voice that hadn't been identified. One presence that had been watching all of this unfold from the shadows. Just like Reeves once had. Waiting. Until the moment came to speak. The voice didn't belong to the past. That was the first thing Cole realized when the call was replayed again. Isolated. Enhanced. Stripped of background noise until all that remained was the tone. The cadence. The hesitation that came just before the words. You buried her twice. Because it didn't sound like memory. It didn't sound like someone recalling something distant. It sounded immediate, present, like the speaker wasn't remembering they were reliving. Which meant one thing. Whoever made that call hadn't just known the case. They had known him.
Reeves.
Up close. Closer than anyone had ever been willing to admit. The interrogation room felt smaller now. Tighter, the air heavier with everything that had already been uncovered, but Reeves sat the same way he had before, posture steady, expression controlled, as if none of it had changed anything, as if the tapes, the land, the compartment, the photographs were just details in a story he had already finished telling himself. Cole didn't start with evidence this time. He started with the call. He played it.
Once.
Then again. Watching not the man's reaction, but the absence of it, because sometimes the most revealing thing isn't what someone shows, it's what they don't. Reeves didn't flinch, didn't shift, but his eyes lingered, just for a second longer than they should have. Recognition. Buried.
But there.
You know that voice, Cole said quietly. Not a question. A statement. Reeves didn't answer immediately. And that pause was enough. Because silence, in this room, had already told the truth more than once. Finally, he exhaled, slow, measured, as if deciding whether the answer mattered anymore. I know a lot of voices, he said. Deflection. Expected. Cole didn't push harder. Not yet. Because pressure applied too early breaks the wrong things. Instead, he shifted.
Back to the tapes.
Back to the sequence. You recorded everything, he said. Why? Reeves tilted his head slightly, the same movement he made when considering a question not for its content, but for its framing, as if the answer depended on how the story was being told. So it wouldn't be forgotten, he said. Simple.
Clean.
And completely wrong. Because nothing about this had been forgotten. It had been hidden, edited, controlled. Cole leaned forward slightly, voice lowering, tightening. But you went back, he said. After. You changed things. That landed. Subtle, but real. Reeves' fingers shifted against the table, just enough to break the stillness he had maintained until now. Not changed, he said. Corrected. The word echoed in the room, heavier than anything else he had said so far, because it revealed something deeper, something that went beyond action into intention, into belief, into the way he saw what he had done. Corrected. As if something had gone wrong. As if the original version hadn't matched what he wanted. Cole felt it click into place. Not fully, but enough. You didn't plan for the diary, he said. Reeves' gaze lifted slightly. Not defensive. Not surprised. Just engaged. Because now the conversation had moved into something he understood. Control. Narrative. The parts of the story that could be shaped. And the ones that couldn't. She wasn't supposed to write about me, Reeves said. There it was. Not denial. Not avoidance. Just a statement of expectation. broken. She saw you, Cole said. Reeves didn't respond. But he didn't need to. Because everything they had found already confirmed it. The entries. The fear. The recognition. The moment when observation became awareness. And awareness became a threat. That's when it changed, Cole continued. That's when you went inside. A long pause. Then, I was already inside. The correction came quietly, almost casually, but it hit harder than anything else because it rewrote the entire sequence, shifted the boundary again, pushed the beginning further back into something that had never been seen, never been acknowledged. Not entry. Presence. Established. Maintained. Hidden. For how long the notebook suggested. For how deep the room they had found confirmed. Cole sat back slightly, letting that settle, because this wasn't just about building a case anymore. It was about understanding a system that had operated undetected for years, maybe longer, a system that didn't rely on force at first, but on access, on familiarity, on the slow erosion of distance between watcher and subject. And then he returned to the only question that still mattered.
The call, he said.
Reeves didn't look away.
Didn't deflect.
But something in his expression shifted again, smaller this time, more contained, like a crack that only showed under the right angle. Cole held it there. Didn't rush. Didn't fill the silence. Because whatever this was, it needed space to surface. Reeves exhaled again. Longer this time. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter. Not weaker. Just different. I didn't expect that, he said. Not what?
That.
The call. The interruption. The moment everything changed. Who is it?
Cole asked.
And for the first time, Reeves hesitated. Not strategically. Not deliberately. But genuinely. Because whatever answer he had, it wasn't simple. It's someone who should know, he said. The words landed with a different kind of weight. Not as a defense, not as a denial, but as a disruption, because if Reeves didn't know exactly who had called, then the control he had maintained for 30 years had already started to slip before they ever opened the file. Cole leaned in slightly, voice lower now, sharper. Someone who saw you? He asked. Reeves didn't answer. But his eyes did. A flicker. Quick. Gone almost instantly. But enough. Because in that moment, something became clear. Reeves hadn't been alone. Not entirely. Not in the way everyone had assumed. There had been another presence. Another set of eyes. Maybe not involved. Maybe not complicit. But aware. At least in part.
And that awareness
had survived. Long enough to make the call. Long enough to break the silence. Cole stood slowly, the chair scraping lightly against the floor, the sound cutting through the tension just enough to reset the room, because the case had shifted again, not away from Reeves, but beyond him, into a space that hadn't been explored yet, a space that held one final piece of the story. Not the act, not the aftermath, but the witness. Because every story like this, no matter how controlled, leaves something behind. A detail, a moment, a person who sees something they shouldn't, and carries it for years, for decades, until the weight becomes too much. Cole turned toward the door, but paused for just a second, just long enough to let one last thought settle into place, one that had been building quietly beneath everything else. Because if someone had known, if someone had watched, if someone had waited 30 years to speak, then maybe the truth hadn't been buried as deeply as Reeves believed. Maybe it had been right there. All along, living beside it, growing up around it, silent, until now. And whatever that voice belonged to, it wasn't finished yet. The voice came back before they found it. Not through another call, not through a message or a traceable line, but through something quieter, something that didn't announce itself, didn't demand attention, just arrived and waited, a letter and signed, unremarkable on the outside, delivered without a return address, slipping through the system the same way the call had slipped through the noise, unnoticed until it was opened. Inside, a single sentence. I saw the light too. Cole read it twice, then a third time, because it wasn't new information. It was confirmation. The neighbor, the light in the house after she was gone, the detail that had been dismissed, minimized, buried in reports that no one had taken seriously enough. Except someone had. Someone who hadn't spoken back then. Someone who had watched. And stayed silent. Until now. The paper was old, but not aged. Written recently.
Carefully.
The handwriting didn't match anything in the case file, not the diary, not Reeves' notes, not any of the statements collected over the years. Which meant one thing. This wasn't the past reaching forward. This was the present stepping in.
Cole went back to the neighbor.
Not as a formality. Not as a routine follow-up. But as a necessity. Because the letter didn't exist in isolation. It connected to something already known, something already recorded, something that had been overlooked once and couldn't be overlooked again. She answered the door slower this time. Age had settled into her movements, into her voice, into the way she looked at the world. But her eyes, they hadn't changed, still sharp, still holding on to details most people let go of. Cole didn't show her the letter immediately. He didn't need to. "I need you to tell me again," he said, "about the night you saw the light." She hesitated. Not because she didn't remember, but because remembering had never stopped. "It wasn't just one night," she said quietly. "It was 3. That was new. The reports only mentioned one. A single sighting. Uncertain. Easy to dismiss. But 3. 3 was pattern. 3 was intention. Why didn't you say that before?"
Cole asked.
Her gaze dropped slightly, just for a moment. "Because no one asked me the right way," she said. The answer sat heavier than it should have. Because it wasn't just about her. It was about the case. About everything that had been missed, everything that had been assumed instead of questioned. Cole nodded slowly. "Did you ever see anyone?" he asked. She didn't respond right away. And that silence felt different this time. Not uncertain. Not hesitant. But deliberate. "I saw a shadow," she said finally. "Once." Cole leaned forward slightly, not pushing, just listening. "It moved past the window," she continued. "Too tall to be her. Too slow to be someone leaving." Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. "I thought it was him," she said. "Him?"
Cole asked.
She nodded. "The man who used to come by," she said. "Fix things. Jonathan Reeves." "Of course. But I wasn't sure," she added quickly. Not enough to say it out loud. Not back then. "Cole, let that settle. Because uncertainty is what keeps people silent. Not fear. Not always. Just the absence of certainty. And sometimes that's enough." He placed the letter on the table between them. She looked at it. Didn't touch it. But something in her expression shifted. Recognition. Not of the words, but of the idea. "You didn't write this," Cole said. She shook her head immediately.
"No."
But her eyes didn't leave the page. "Do you know who did?" he asked. A longer pause this time. Heavier. Because whatever answer she had, it wasn't simple. "There was a boy," she said finally. The word hung in the air. Unexpected. Out of place. But somehow fitting. "He lived 2 houses down," she continued. Quiet. Kept to himself. Always outside at night. Cole felt it click. Another presence. Another set of eyes. Not involved. But there. Watching. "He used to sit on his porch," she said. Late. After everyone else went inside. Cole didn't interrupt. Didn't need to. Because the picture was already forming. "I saw him looking at her house once," she added. Same night the light was on. The room shifted again. Because this wasn't speculation anymore. This was connection. A witness. Unintentional. Unseen. But present. "What was his name?"
Cole asked.
She frowned slightly, searching through memory that had been left untouched for too long.
"Daniel," she said.
"I think." It wasn't much. Just a name. No last name. No current address. No guarantee he was still there. But it was enough. Because cases like this don't need certainty to move forward. They need direction. And this was direction. Records were pulled again. Old property listings. School enrollments. Anything that could place a boy named Daniel in that neighborhood in 1995. It took hours. Then longer. Because time had done what it always does, scattered people, changed names, erased easy connections. But eventually something surfaced. A match. Close enough. Daniel Mercer. Moved out of state in the early 2000s. No criminal record. No reason to stand out. Just another life that had continued while this one had stayed frozen. Cole made the call. Not expecting an answer. Not expecting anything really. Because 30 years is a long time to carry something. Long enough to forget. Or to choose not to remember. But the phone rang. Once. Twice. Then a click. Silence. And then a voice. Older. Deeper. But steady. Hello. Cole didn't introduce himself immediately. Didn't rush. Because this moment mattered. Daniel, he said. My name is Detective Cole. I'm calling about something that happened in Florida. In 1995. The line didn't disconnect. But it didn't respond either. Just breathing. Controlled. Measured. I think you already know what this is about, Cole added. A longer silence. Then, I wondered when someone would call, Daniel said. No surprise. No confusion. Just acknowledgement. Cole closed his eyes for a brief second. Because that was it. The final piece. The voice. Not from guilt. Not from involvement. But from memory. From something seen and carried. For decades. You made the call, Cole said. Another pause. Then, yes. Simple. Uncomplicated. But heavier than anything else in the case. Why now? Cole asked. The answer didn't come right away. But when it didn't hesitate. Because I heard you found him, Daniel said. Him. Not her. Not the case. Him. Reeves. I didn't know what I saw back then, he continued. Not really. I just watched. Cole didn't interrupt. Because this wasn't interrogation. This was release. I saw him go into the house, Daniel said. Late. After the lights were off. The words aligned perfectly. Too perfectly. I saw the light come on, he added. Move around. The neighbor. The confirmation. I thought maybe he was helping her, Daniel said. Fixing something. The same mistake. I didn't think. He stopped. Didn't finish. Didn't need to. Because the rest was already there. Carried for 30 years. I saw him come back, Daniel said quietly. After. The room seemed to narrow around that word. After. Not before. Not during. After. He had something with him, Daniel continued. I couldn't see what. Just something heavy. Cole felt it settle into place. The return. The removal. The second step in a sequence no one had seen. I didn't say anything, Daniel added. Not defensive. Not apologetic. Just true. I was a kid, he said. I didn't understand. Cole let the silence follow. Because understanding isn't immediate. Not then. Not now. But it comes. Eventually. I remembered it later, Daniel said. When I got older. When it started to make sense. Another pause. I tried to forget, he added. For a long time. Of course he did. Because some things don't leave. They wait. Until they're forced back into the light. But when I heard the case was reopened, he said, voice tightening just slightly, I knew I couldn't stay quiet again. Cole didn't speak for a moment. Didn't need to. Because everything that had been missing. Everything that had been buried. Everything that had been left incomplete. Was finally there. The diary. The tapes. The land. The room. And now. The witness. The last voice in a story that had refused to end. Cole opened his eyes slowly, the weight of it settling not as tension anymore, but as something else, something closer to closure. But not clean, not simple, just complete in the way only truth can be after being hidden for too long. Thank you, he said quietly. The line stayed open for a second longer. Then, it ended. No final words. No resolution in the voice itself. Because the resolution wasn't there. It was here. In everything that had finally been brought together. Reeves would be charged. The evidence was overwhelming now. Not just pieces. A full sequence. A narrative that could no longer be altered. No longer corrected. no longer controlled. But even as the case closed, even as the file that had once been marked cold case was finally updated, rewritten, reclassified, something remained. Not unanswered, not unknown, but unresolved in a different way. Because the town hadn't forgotten. Not really. It had just learned to live around the absence, to move forward without looking back too often. And now, it couldn't anymore. Because the truth wasn't distant. It wasn't abstract. It was local, familiar. It had lived there, moved through the same streets, knocked on the same doors, fixed the same locks. And all that time, no one had seen it clearly enough. Except one person. A boy on a porch, watching a house across the street, seeing something he didn't understand. Until it was too late. Until the silence became heavier than the memory. And even now, as the case finally reached its end, as the story was told in full, as the name was no longer hidden behind initials or shadows, there was one thing that refused to fade. Not the crime, not the evidence, but the feeling that somewhere, in the quiet hours of the night, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, there are still things being watched, still moments unfolding unseen, still stories that haven't been told. Not yet. And somewhere out there, another voice is waiting, just like this one did, for 30 years, before finally breaking the silence.